On September 7, 2017, a company most Americans had never knowingly interacted with announced that it had lost control of the most sensitive personal information belonging to nearly half the population of the United States: social security numbers, full names, dates of birth, home addresses, in some cases driver's license numbers and credit card details. 147 million people, more than the entire population of Russia, had their identities exposed in a single breach. The company was Equifax. And here's what makes this story different from almost every other one on this channel. The overwhelming majority of the 147 million victims had never signed up for anything, never created an account, never agreed to a terms of service. Equifax is one of 3 major credit bureaus in the United States, companies that collect and sell financial data on virtually every adult with a credit history, whether that person has ever heard of them or not. You cannot opt out of Equifax knowing about you. You can only find out after the fact whether they kept that information safe. They didn't. To understand why this breach mattered so much, it helps to understand what Equifax actually does. Founded in the late 1800s, Equifax is one of the big 3 credit reporting agencies, alongside Experian and TransUnion. These companies compile detailed financial histories on almost every adult in the country, how much debt you carry, whether you pay your bills on time, how much credit you've been extended, and sell that data to banks, landlords, employers, and lenders who use it to decide whether to give you a loan, rent you an apartment, or hire you. The business model is unusual in a way that matters enormously here. You are not Equifax's customer. The banks and lenders who buy your data are the customer. You are the product. And because you never chose to have a relationship with Equifax in the first place, you also never had the option to walk away when they failed to protect what they collected on you. The technical failure at the center of this breach is almost painfully mundane, which is part of what makes it so damning. Equifax ran a piece of open-source web application software called Apache Struts, used to power parts of its online dispute portal, the website where consumers could go to challenge errors on their credit report. In March 2017, a serious vulnerability in Apache Struts was publicly disclosed, along with a patch to fix it. This wasn't a secret flaw discovered by sophisticated hackers, it was a known, published vulnerability, the kind that security teams at every major company are expected to identify and patch within days, precisely because once a fix is public, so is a roadmap for anyone wanting to exploit systems that haven't applied it yet. Equifax's internal security team was notified about the vulnerability and instructed relevant staff to patch the affected systems. According to the company's own later account to Congress, that instruction didn't reach everyone who needed it, and the specific server running the vulnerable software was missed. Compounding the failure, Equifax's own internal scanning tool, designed specifically to catch unpatched systems like this one, failed to detect the vulnerable server, reportedly due to a separate technical misconfiguration. 2 independent safety nets, a communication process, and an automated scanner both failed on the same server, and nobody caught it. The vulnerability sat open for months. In mid-May 2017, attackers found it. Once inside, the attackers didn't smash and grab. They moved carefully, exploring Equifax's internal network for weeks, eventually locating databases containing consumer personal information, and, critically, finding those databases stored with data that wasn't adequately encrypted for a system already known to be exposed. Investigators later determined the attackers accessed Equifax's systems from mid-May until the intrusion was finally discovered on July 29, a window of 76 days, during which attackers were quietly extracting data in small batches, spread across dozens of separate database queries, specifically structured to avoid tripping alarm thresholds that would flag a single large data transfer. When Equifax's security team finally noticed unusual network activity in late July and began investigating, they shut down the compromised web application within about a day of discovery, but by then, the data was already out. Equifax discovered the breach on July 29, 2017. It did not tell the public until September 7, a gap of nearly 6 weeks. The company has said this period was necessary to investigate the scope of the breach, bring in outside forensic experts, and prepare consumer support infrastructure like a dedicated website and call centers before going public. There's a legitimate version of that argument. A company that announces a breach before it understands its scope risks giving out wrong information and creating more confusion, not less. But the 6-week gap looks considerably worse in light of what happened during it. 3 senior Equifax executives, including the company's chief financial officer, sold shares of Equifax stock in the days immediately following the company's internal discovery of the breach, but before it was disclosed to the public. Combined, the sales were worth close to $2 million. Equifax maintained that none of the executives involved knew the details of the breach at the time they sold, and an internal company investigation later cleared them of wrongdoing on that specific point. The U.S. Attorney's Office and the SEC separately investigated. Ultimately, no insider trading charges were filed against those 3 executives specifically. That outcome didn't do much to quiet public anger, and there was a separate, more serious case connected to the same breach. A former Equifax executive in a different role, who had access to some preliminary unconfirmed information about a major unnamed client experiencing a significant breach, was later criminally charged and convicted of insider trading for using that information to sell his own Equifax stock before the announcement, and to tip off a friend to do the same. He was sentenced to prison. Whatever the full picture inside the company, the pattern was unmistakable. People close to Equifax's leadership were protecting their own finances during the exact window ordinary consumers were left completely in the dark. Equifax's then CEO Richard Smith testified before multiple congressional committees in the weeks following the disclosure, in hearings that became some of the most pointed and publicly humiliating tech accountability sessions in recent memory. Smith took responsibility for the breach in his testimony and announced his early retirement days before one of the hearings, forgoing part of his exit compensation package amid the public pressure, though he still left with a substantial retirement package built up over his tenure. One detail from the aftermath became a lasting symbol of how badly Equifax's security organization had been structured. Reporting emerged that the company's chief security officer, at the time of the breach, held an undergraduate and graduate degree in music composition, rather than a background in computer science or cybersecurity. To be fair to her specifically, she had spent years working in technology and security roles before joining Equifax, and an unconventional academic background doesn't automatically indicate incompetence. But in the context of a breach this catastrophic, the detail spread widely as shorthand for a company that hadn't taken cybersecurity leadership as seriously as the scale of the data it was sitting on demanded. Both the Sue Wayne, the company's chief information officer, left the company in the weeks following the breach. While the vast majority of the 147 million affected were American, the breach wasn't contained to the United States. Equifax later confirmed that personal data belonging to close to 700,000 UK residents and roughly 19,000 Canadians had also been exposed. Since Equifax operates internationally and stored some non-use consumer data on the same vulnerable systems, UK regulators separately fined Equifax's British subsidiary £500,000, the maximum penalty available under the data protection law in force at the time, for failing to take appropriate steps to protect UK citizens' data. Even though the breach itself had occurred on servers in the United States, the financial reckoning for Equifax unfolded over years. In 2019, the company reached a landmark settlement with the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and all 50 states plus US territories, agreeing to pay up to $700 million, at the time, one of the largest data breach settlements in history. The settlement included a fund of up to $425 million specifically to help affected consumers pay for credit monitoring, identity theft protection, and to reimburse people who could show direct financial harm from the breach. Equifax's total costs related to the breach, factoring in the settlement, legal fees, security overhauls, and other cleanup costs, are estimated to have exceeded $1.4 billion by the time the dust settled, a bill that notably Equifax's shareholders and, indirectly, its ongoing business customers absorbed far more directly than any individual consumer whose data was stolen, since Equifax remained a highly profitable ongoing business throughout. One detail from that settlement became a small viral moment of its own. Consumers affected by the breach were initially offered a choice between free credit monitoring or a cash payment of up to $125, intended for people who already had credit monitoring and didn't need Equifax's version. So many people opted for the cash instead of the monitoring that regulators publicly warned the total claims would vastly exceed the small portion of the settlement fund actually allocated for cash payments, meaning most people who chose the cash option ultimately received a tiny fraction of the $125 they'd expected, sometimes just a few dollars. Once the available pool was divided among the enormous number of claimants, it became a minor cautionary tale in its own right about reading settlement terms carefully. For years after the breach, the identity of the attackers themselves remained largely a mystery to the public, overshadowed by the drama of the internal failures and executive stock sales that changed in February 2020 when the USS Department of Justice unsealed criminal charges against 4 members of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, alleging they were responsible for carrying out the intrusion as part of a state-sponsored operation. The indictment described a level of technical sophistication considerably beyond what the breach's underlying cause, an unpatched publicly known vulnerability, might suggest. Investigators alleged the group had routed traffic through servers in roughly 20 countries, specifically to obscure their tracks, and had taken deliberate steps to wipe log files in an effort to cover their activity inside Equifax's network. China's government has denied any involvement. As with most state-attributed cyber-attacks, no meaningful prosecution has followed, since none of the individuals charged are in USS custody or likely to be. The indictment did, however, reframe how the breach is understood in hindsight. Not simply a case of corporate carelessness meeting opportunistic criminals, but corporate carelessness meeting a patient, well-resourced state intelligence operations specifically interested in acquiring detailed financial and identity data on a huge cross-section of the American population. It's worth pausing on what this kind of breach actually means for the people whose data was taken, beyond the headline numbers. A stolen social security number doesn't expire and can't be reissued the way a credit card number can. Once it's out permanently, which is part of why Equifax's settlement included lifetime credit monitoring options rather than a fixed multi-year period. Victims of the kind of identity theft this breach enabled have reported consequences ranging from fraudulent tax returns filed in their name to intercept refunds to entirely new credit accounts and loans opened without their knowledge, sometimes taking months or years of disputes with lenders and credit bureaus, including, with a particular irony, Equifax itself, to fully unwind. Because the stolen data included the exact combination of information, full name, date of birth, social security number, address, that most financial institutions still rely on to verify someone's identity, the breach didn't just expose a moment in time, it permanently degraded the reliability of the entire identity verification system those institutions had been leaning on for decades. In the years since, Equifax has publicly stated it invested hundreds of millions of dollars into overhauling its security infrastructure, including new leadership roles specifically focused on cybersecurity accountability, more rigorous patch management processes, and expanded encryption of sensitive data at rest. Whether that investment fully closed the gap that let a single unpatched web server expose 147 million people's identities is something outside observers still debate. Credit bureaus, by the nature of their business model, remain enormously attractive targets simply because of the sheer density of sensitive financial data they hold in one place. For consumers, the practical legacy of the Equifax breach was a shift in how seriously people started taking credit freezes. A free tool, now more widely publicized and easier to use as a direct result of this breach, that lets anyone lock their credit file so it can't be accessed to open new accounts in their name without their explicit unlock. It's one of the only concrete, individual defenses that came out of a breach where the actual victims never had a say in how their data was handled in the first place. What makes Equifax such a stark entry in this series isn't the sophistication of the attack. There wasn't much. It's the layered, almost mundane ordinariness of the failure. A known vulnerability, a patch that existed and simply wasn't applied, a scanning tool that should have caught the gap and didn't, and 76 days for attackers to work undisturbed inside a network holding some of the most sensitive data in the country. Every individual failure was survivable on its own. Stacked together, over months, they added up to the largest breach of personal identity data in US history at the time. And underneath all of it sits the detail that makes Equifax genuinely different from a company like Target or Mijiame, which we'll get to in this series. The victims weren't customers who chose to trust Equifax with anything. They were simply people who existed inside the American credit system, whether they liked it or not. Next time, we head to a heist that makes even Equifax's numbers look modest. Nearly $1 billion, almost stolen in a single night, stopped in large part by a single misspelled word. That's the Bangladesh bank heist.